Good evening, everyone, and happy Halloween to those among you who celebrate a particular version of that bastardized pagan ritual. In any case, today we shall be reading Youjo Senki, The Saga of Tanya the Evil, Volume 3, The Finest Hour, Chapter 5, Internal Affairs. Now, before we begin with that, I just want to say, terribly sorry if you hear any sort of background noise during the course of this recording. We seem to have frequent iterants of fireworks springing up around the neighborhood, and as such, my dog is not exactly compliant in, providing a silent working environment. Nonetheless, it is presently 8:25 p.m. or 20-25 hours on October 31st of 2018. Anyway, continuing from the top of the chapter, and terribly sorry for this brief little diatribe. In any case, Chapter 5, Internal Affairs. Perhaps this needs to be reconfirmed. We are soldiers, and as such, if the government of the fatherland wishes something, we fulfill. One's personal will at such a time is unimportant. Allow me to reread that. Perhaps this needs to be reconfirmed. We are soldiers, and as such, if the government of the fatherland wishes something, we fulfill. One's personal will at such a time is unimportant. A quote from Lieutenant General von Zetour from a General Staff meeting's minutes. A certain dimension, a certain domain of existence. Interesting way to set the setting here. The being there trembled with joy. Ho, wonderful. He was so happy he nearly praised the glory of the Lord in spite of himself. No, he did. To solemnly praise the almighty being, he raised a pious face to the heavens and shouted hallelujah. Of course, no one in this place would reproach him for such an act. Rather, they would join in. After all, they were creatures of that being as intelligent as the spaghetti monster. Okay, editor's note here. Spaghetti monster, a being possessing great intelligence, so noble that even atheist scholars believe ramen. Oh, that is a horrible pun. Oh, Christ. Okay, ramen is like, the Japanese food dish, the noodle dish. And they're saying R, capital R, amen. That pun translates so well, I just can't stop laughing, my God. Anyway, he's also he's literally just criticizing them, saying they're basically as ridiculous a notion that they might exist as the quote-unquote spaghetti monster, which is like, basically it's an example of what people would say if they believe something is a hoax, more or less. Anyway, Sherab, sir, did something happen? Oh, Archangel, keep up the good work. I'm just so happy that faith has been growing by leaps and bounds lately. Having finished his exalting prayer, he responded to the address with a smile and praised the Homosapiens' return to the life and death cycle. What wonderful news! The Sherab's manner all but proclaimed, expressing his relief that order had finally been restored. These beings were charged with leading the creatures known as Homosapiens, guiding their souls, and this was the first positive report they had received in quite a while. And it was only natural that the Archangel, upon hearing it, would smile and express his approval. Naturally, he celebrated that things were as they should be. It was a hymn for the Great One, nearly overflowing from his heart and very being. O God, creator of the universe, thou art great. This is very good indeed. But that's strange. Hold on. Yet, doubt appeared on the Archangel's fine features. Restored faith and a promised return to the cycle of life and death was indeed wonderful news. If their appeals to the people had been effective, then eventually they would be able to guide their souls. But something suddenly confused the Archangel. He had the feeling that only a short time ago he had heard something far different. They were all equal before the one in all and outside the hierarchy of their obligations, rather tolerant. Thus, it was permissible for him to second-guess the words of a superior being, which is why, perhaps it should be said, as long as the Archangel was engaged in holy work, he had an obligation to ask the Sherab something he didn't fully understand himself. Is something wrong? And the Sherab was obliged to answer due to his rank. For them, delays in holy duties were unforgivable, so any and all obstacles had to be overcome. Naturally, the Sherab politely responded with good intentions, his voice soft. To him, it was proper to work together in the fight for the glory of the Lord. Both of them only meant well. I hear evil atheists have infested their world. That was why they had to stand up and bravely confront evil. It was their sacred duty. What? Nothing like that is happening in my jurisdiction, I can tell you that. Do you know whose it is? But the Archangel had raised an issue the Sherab hadn't heard of. In his area, the people were definitely beginning to sense the presence of God. Yes, they all clung piously to his voice, acting as was right for his creatures to act, and fervently wished for the Almighty Father's grace. To the Sherab, protecting and guiding humble believers was a delight. Nothing made him happier. No, it was his raison d'etre. He was created for no other purpose but this. Which was why he simply smiled happily. These beings had transcended the loathsome habits of sectionalism, but paradoxically, the news that the horrible, well-meaning evil of atheism had filled the little lambs they were meant to protect and guide pained his heart to the point of bursting. Just hearing that atheists were running rampant cast a shadow across his beautiful face. For such a thing to happen in one's jurisdiction was a great sorrow indeed. Therefore, out of utter kindness and a sense of duty, he had to ask if such terrible tragedy was occurring. I'd like to do anything I can to assist. Does anyone know whose jurisdiction it is? He felt he had to express a helping hand under the circumstances. Alas, I am ashamed to admit it, but it is my own. Naturally, rather than conceal this awkward problem, it was better to solve it together. After all, that was their job as guides. No, moreover, it was their holy duty as creations of the Lord. If they couldn't lead the lost lambs properly, how could they claim to be guides? Ushering lost lambs down the path of righteousness with joy to be as they were meant to be was their one and only raison d'etre. Anyone who neglected it could only be seen as a fallen, evil being beyond all salvation. So an offer of aid on the path of salvation was always welcome. That said, while these things sometimes happened, the unspoken expectation was that it was relatively inexperienced beings themselves liable to stray who would fail in their guidance. Which was why all the beings present were shocked and horrified to hear that their supervisor wasn't sure how to proceed with his guidance. The ones under your guidance, Sir Seraph. How could such a thing have come to pass? The Seraphim served the Father most closely of all. Yet this one's guidance wasn't reaching the people. The guidance of this truly faithful seraph who was trusted just as deeply by God the Father. If a seraph wasn't enough to save them, then it really was a puzzle. Yes, lamentably, the fools have not only abandoned their faith, they even, if you can believe it, blaspheme. Blasphemy! How dare they? Rather than understanding the sheep, the beings could be described as basically unconcerned. Only rarely did something occur to cause a change in their attitude. But this was even rarer than that. It was that shocking. They were up against mass atheism. Not only that, but reports indicated that behavior judgments judged to be blasphemous were happening on the same scale. They were committing the sin of holy sacrilege. But if that was true, why? Would it spread to them all, like a plague? Those were the questions on their uncomprehending minds. It shouldn't be possible. I hear there is even an outrageous movement to deify their rulers. But the seraph spat the reply, as if saying it disgusted him, and removed all doubt from their minds. For a moment, all were silent. A beat later, the meaning of what he had said finally sunk in, and astonishment followed. Have they really so little to fear? What sort of person would you have to be to do such things? Oh, it's revolting to even say, but apparently they lump in God with opium. He provided the explanation reluctantly. How could the origin of the world be equated to something so unclean? There were even some recalcitrants aiming to replace God the Father. Even the beings who fell in the past hadn't come up with something so awful. That's why it was so unsettling. They were simply stunned. What? Is there no limit to the horror? That was more or less how they felt. That was one thought that didn't get voiced. There was one thought that didn't get voiced. How could this have happened? This just isn't going very well, is it? The Sherab lamented with a sigh. In spite of himself. But it was likewise the unmistakable sentiment of all present. His overflowing joy of a moment ago had been replaced with sadness, as if it had never been. Departing from the text for a moment, when they say that the people are likening God to opium, he's referring to Karl Marx, who called God the opiate of the masses. In other words, they're referring to the Soviet Union or the Russo Confederacy, I believe is what they call it in the Youjo Senki universe. So given that, they're probably insinuating that the communists are spreading atheism, and atheism is basically their new religion, and they're basically stating that the state is God, and vice versa, as defined by the leader. So if the state is God in communism, and communism is the new religion, then therefore the head of state, in this case Joseph Stalin, is quite literally basically the pope of the new religion, the cult of the state, effectively. Which, interestingly enough, is not too dissimilar to how fascism and fascist irredentism actually looks at things. But I'm getting off topic here. Suffice it to say, that's the context of this conversation here. We've basically got the Being X's underlings, more or less, talking about how they're failing in their duties, and as a consequence of that, they're like, okay, what do we do now? Continuing here on the next page, page 179. But half the world is still filled with pious little lambs seeking salvation. They had finally managed to bring the voice of God to the believers. During the war, the humans had finally begun to seek salvation from a transcendental being. I can't believe the other half have fallen to the wickedness of atheism. That half the world should have fallen into darkness where the good news wouldn't reach. With all due respect, I find that hard to believe. They've received the good news, I tell you. How could half the world have descended into the primitive darkness of atheism, or what have you? Is that really and truly possible? At the same time, the Archangel and other angels sighed their doubts. They questioned whether it could really be possible. They agonized over whether it could really become a majority. It was truly an unthinkable circumstance. No, they were in denial of the impossible phenomenon. For something like that should never happen to a group who had been given the good news. Perhaps it could happen to a single person. There were examples in Homosapien history of individuals being seized by such insanity. Their policy on those isolated examples was to de-emphasize them, though they were interested in humans as a group. They were nearly indifferent to them as individuals, however. But a group who had received the good news of the gospel descending into such darkness was worrisome indeed. It was virtually unheard of, to be frank. If they searched the past, they could find examples of new forms of faith, or reduced faith. So they had experience dealing with such problems. But this had never happened before, and neither had any anticipated it. It certainly is strange. Good grief, what could have come over them? That said, they couldn't simply weep and fail to act. They were tirelessly faithful to their duties, and as such, they scraped together all their wisdom. If we want to restore faith, what about sending in, that one? The glory of being God's servant is too great a responsibility for just one, and a human at that. I see, yes, it might be too harsh to simply say, know God's will. In the past, Homosapiens only managed it after we told them several times over, and they finally listened. Then how about continuing to call out to them? No, we can't save them that way. Leaving faithless souls to wander would go against God's will. They must be purged. The conclusion they reached out of their utter goodwill was to go with their usual way, quote-unquote, of restoring faith. Then wouldn't the best way be to teach Homosapiens of his grace through trials? As for the vital how of the matter, the Sherab suggested a method through which he had had some success, and the others eagerly accepted. I see. If we give them that one, the glory of fighting as a servant of God, we can expect a conversion to occur en masse. After all, though they were generally indifferent to individuals, they were already keeping an eye on one of them. Since faith had already been growing as a result, it was more than worth trying in this case as well. Please wait. The glory of fighting as God's servant shouldn't be reserved for a single individual. Enlightenment is important, but I think it is vital to respond to the prayers of the deeply faithful as well. And they had good intentions. The suggestion of having that one fight for the grace of God was made with utterly good intentions. We must convert the lamb who forgot the light of God's protection and glory, and we must save those who pray. Then let us do that. How about specifics? Everyone welcomed the opinion. They were saviors. The protests of an individual meant to deliver his grace were meaningless to them. No, since no one had the ears to hear them, no one would point out they should listen. Well, if anything, perhaps it was a difference of perspective. Even humans are virtually incapable of listening to non-human opinions. Shall we ask the throne? All right, I will mention it to the Lord and await his judgment on the matter. Thus, it was decided without a single objection. August 22nd, Unified Year 1925. It was 2 months after the fall of the mainland republic. At the time, suffice it to say that everyone living in the empire believed that the war was over. After all, the empire had defeated the neighboring Auntaunt alliance, the Republic, and, incidentally, the Principality of Dacia. The boast, "We are the Reich, crown of the world," had begun to have a ring of truth to it. Even the news that the Commonwealth had joined in on the side of the Republic wasn't enough to dampen the euphoria in the streets. With no major fighting or naval battles, no one expected the Commonwealth to be an obstacle to the restoration of peace. Everyone murmured as if they knew. They joined the battle far too late. So when it was reported that the Commonwealth had rejected the Empire's invitation to a peace conference, the public sentiment in the Empire was mainly confusion. They couldn't understand what made the war so enjoyable that the Commonwealth was itching to continue it. Of course, people in the Empire were well aware that the Free Republican Army, made up of Republican troops who howled that they would resist to the end, was putting up a meager fight in some Republican colonies. More importantly, it was also reported that the Commonwealth and its kingdoms, having decided to intervene in this war, were cooperating actively with the Free Republican Army. But even knowing all that, everyone still had to wonder, Just why are they so interested in continuing the war? The outcome had already been decided on the battlefield quite definitively. The Imperial army had literally wiped out the Auntaunt Alliance army, the Principality of Dakia's army, and the Republican army, and its power as the conqueror was known far and wide. And while the Empire's terms were indeed harsh, the people believed it was fundamentally a treaty that could restore peace in its present form. So the resistance of the obstinate Republican remnants and the stubborn Commonwealth was irritating at first, and then anger-inducing as it wore on. Why do they want to continue the war so badly? Eventually, they realized something. Weren't they the ones that started this war? That was no small matter. No, it was the open truth. Which was why, in the Empire, the psychological foundation had been laid from the beginning. They believed those remnants of the enemy, believed that they hoped to continue the war to the bitter end. Hence their own hopes. We'll bring the iron hammer down on those who would dare harm the Reich. May the evil enemy be struck from this world and wiped off the face of the earth. So the fanatical cry of smite the enemy spread. No one questioned their belief in the righteousness of their own country and justice of their cause, which was why they couldn't understand. The Empire failed to comprehend the fear the other countries had, the fundamental fear that an immensely powerful jingoistic state, an unrivaled hegemon, would be established in the center of the continent. Additionally, due to the manner in which the Empire had been founded, it had always had multiple conflict zones. The conflicts stemmed from incompatible views. To the Empire, those places were unquestionably Imperial territory, while to the surrounding countries, the land had been stolen from them. Ultimately, that was why the Republic worked with the other powers to encircle the Empire using exterior lines strategy, and why the Empire developed its interior lines strategy to break through that encirclement, which it has now successfully done. Then, finally, the Empire was overjoyed to have eliminated all the threats to its security. But to the other parties, it looked like a grave threat to their security that simply could not be ignored. Sadly, the Empire was so busy showing off the sharpness of its sword that it didn't notice how much it frightened everyone. Then, nationalism and mutual distrust fanned the flames of war. Of course, everyone wished for peace. Yes, earnestly. Which was why, for the sake of that peace and protecting everyone, they took up their guns and fought. Other countries with their own agendas added their support. In this ironic way, the wish for peace didn't cause the war to abate, but instead only escalated it. The same day, the United States of America. In one room of the recruitment office, the major introduced as both the occupant of the office and the head of the department in charge of conscription spoke honestly as he somewhat awkwardly offered marysue a seat. "Miss Marysue, we're very happy to receive your application." His voice was calm, and he looked her straight in the eye. But the United States views dual citizenship as an extremely complicated issue. Especially given the citizenship law in the Auntaunt Alliance, volunteering for the United States Army could ultimately harm your status there. So I must warn you that despite your youth, it is very likely you will need to make a choice regarding your nationality. He continued politely, saying he didn't mean to press her for the difficult decision, but still respecting her will. The kind people of the United States were always so considerate like that. Everyone said the same friendly things to the Auntaunt Alliance refugee kids. Quote, "We're glad you want to help, but you don't need to worry about that just now." End quote. Doesn't your grandmother, your mother, and, yes, even your deceased father want you to stay safe here out of harm's way? Isn't everyone worried about you? Yes, but that's exactly why I want to do what I can. To protect this peace. I think I can help. So Mary explained earnestly in her own words why she was volunteering. I think there must be something I can do, surely. She appealed to the Major to let her do what she could for the United States and for world peace. Well, you do have a point. The United States Army is currently recruiting volunteer units that will be sent to our ally, the Commonwealth. That's one way, as you mentioned, to protect this peace. But there are many other helpful and necessary tasks young people can undertake inside of the United States. The call had gone out regarding the United States Volunteer Expeditionary Forces to be deployed to the Commonwealth. It was said that these troops would, as a rule, not intervene in combat actions, but be quote-unquote stationed in the Commonwealth. The troops were nominally being deployed in connection with patrols to guarantee free passage and civilian rights according to the laws of war. But everyone read the move as a turning point in the geopolitical situation, the United States' first decisive step, which was why Mary reacted immediately. She raced down to the nearest recruitment office to turn in her application, only to be kindly told, "It's too soon, as usual." You mean as a good citizen of the United States? Exactly. Children should be protected, as a general rule. Our situation isn't so dire that we have to send them off to war. Actually, you're only just old enough to volunteer, strictly speaking. It wouldn't be too late if you take some time to make your decision, you know. Wouldn't you like to try being a good citizen of this great country? He asked. The United States was generous enough to interpret the law flexibly and grant dual citizenship to refugees from the Auntaunt alliance who had close relatives who were already residents. In that way, by offering the refugees a quiet life and a little shot at peace, it made a place for them. Mary understood that the reason they didn't want to send the youth to war, as he explained to her again, was that they hoped the ones that they had taken in would be safe. But Mary could volunteer. The citizenship she had been granted and her ability as a mage qualified her for that. So she had already considered her position well in advance and arrived at her own conclusion. I know. I've thought it over already, but sure enough, believe me, earnestly, I would like to volunteer. The flag on display in the center of the room was not the flag of her fatherland, but of the United States of America. To Mary, it wasn't the flag of her homeland. It was different from the Auntaunt Alliance flag the mother and father she loved and respected had displayed proudly and prominently in their own house. But it was the flag of their second home, the country that was kind enough to take them in. If my grandfather and mother, grandmother and mother, the family I must protect are here, if there is something I can do to help stop this war, then... Miss Marysue, if you go into battle, you might be injured. You could easily die. You might upset your grandmother and mother. I do feel a bit bad about that, but I would regret not doing so even more. I would regret not doing what I can even more. She had worried about that. It was the only thing she had worried about. But compelled by her inner drive to do something, she could state positively, "That may be so, but there's something I must do." Are you certain? Yes, I have decided to volunteer. In her mind, she'd thought of her home country and the people's backs as they prayed at the church. Grief, sadness, and a wish for peace. She would give her whole self for those things, if it would make any difference at all. For God, for their families, and for themselves, they would do what they could. All right, then you need to make an oath to the flag. Do you remember how it goes? Yes, I've memorized it. Seems like you're quite determined then. Once you volunteer, you must do whatever your military duties require of you. Do you understand? The Major pushed his point in what could be called his final confirmation. Because Mary understood that he was hoping she would change her mind, she replied too quickly, leaving no room for objections. Of course, I'll make the oath. Standing, she raised a hand and swore. She pledged herself valiantly to the United States of America. I pledge allegiance. It was one girl, Marysue's contract with the United States of America. Powers had to be wielded with justice, so she would do what she could with them. To the United States and its countrymen, one nation, under God, indivisible, she would use all of her strength for the family she had to protect, for the people, and to carry out God's righteous justice, and to defend its republic, to create a world in which she would never again have to experience the sadness of losing family to the empire. In the name of liberty and justice, she swore with her own sense of justice that she virtuously believed in. May God protect you. Dear God, please, oh please, protect us in our hour of need. Thus, with a sincere prayer, Marysue enlisted and was assigned with the other volunteer mages to the United States Free Auntaunt Alliance 1st Mage Regiment. And we have here a picture on the left-hand side of page here, which would be page 186, showing Marysue pledging her allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. Interesting to note, this, I do believe, was the more or less final scene of the anime in Season 1, with the exception of a brief sort of after-credit sequence. Actually, no, the after-credit sequence in North Africa, I do believe, came prior to this. This was indeed the final scene of the anime, full stop. And she had her eyes glowing here, basically signifying that, like her father, she too had been granted powers by being X, or his underlings, in the sky. Suffice it to say, you're in luck, gentlemen. Everything from here on is either going to be new content, or perhaps a little snippet here or there that may have been included in the anime out of order relative to the original text. So, if that inspires you, I encourage you to listen all the more attentively from here on out. Alright, continuing here on the top of page 187, well, slightly below, just at the start of the next setting here. August 24th, Unified Year 1925. Imperial Army General Staff Office, Dining Room 1. The cafeteria at the General Staff Office made a rule for itself that the meals it served must be equal or inferior in quality to those of the mobilized soldiers in the field. Due to the prevalence of that touching rumor around the Empire, Dining Room 1 was deserted as usual. The only ones to appear at the cafeteria were those required by unavoidable circumstance to eat there. The people thus in the predicament of reluctantly sipping the awful pseudo-coffee were stuck washing down their complaints about its quality with either tasteless water or said pseudo-coffee. I suppose it's a reward for the victory. You and I have been promoted. Congratulations, Lieutenant General von Zetour. Thanks to you as well, Lieutenant General von Rudersdorf. Now, let's get back to business. Indeed. This isn't the place for a celebration in any case, they joked wryly. And so, the awful ersatz coffee put a damper on the pair's celebration of their respective promotions to Lieutenant General. When Zetour made the practical suggestion of getting back to business, Rudersdorf didn't feel the atmosphere was right for a celebration either. That was the General Staff Office cafeteria in a nutshell. All right, then. So Rudersdorf flatly changed gears and brought up the pending issue before them, that namely the next stage of their operations. Though the Republican army on the mainland was indeed completely under control and thoroughly suppressed, remnants of the forces now calling themselves the Free Republican Army were holed up and holding out in the Republican colonies. The Commonwealth had joined the fight, and the Imperial High Seas Fleet was facing its navy, but unfortunately there was still quite a large gap between the two in terms of strength. Even if the Empire sent its entire fleet, it would only amount to half the size of the Commonwealth's. Though the public and some of Supreme High Command were enthusiastic about an invasion of the Commonwealth mainland, Zetour and Rudersdorf were at wits' end over how few options they realistically had under the circumstances, given their army's continuing fighting power. With circumstances such as they are, I think it makes sense to launch operations in the south with the objectives of blockading the inner sea, that would be the Mediterranean Sea in our timeline, and defeating the last of the Republican forces. For that reason, as part of their plan to handle the war situation, they first considered a southern campaign against the remnants of the Republican army on the southern continent, in other words, North Africa. They would demonstrate that the Empire was capable of sending troops to the enemy's colonies. Such a reality could inspire at least the Republican army and colonies to sue for peace. So the Imperial Army General Staff, who could no longer find any point in continuing the war, to the Imperial Army General Staff, who could no longer find any point in continuing the war, that speculation was a realistic plan of compromise to end the fighting as quickly as possible. If they could settle things without occupying every last hostile country and just negotiate, that would be much easier. Allow me to make one point. I understand what you're saying, but our nation has limited power projection capabilities, and our maritime forces on the inner sea are equally tight. You're quite right, Zatur, and that's why I'm asking you a favor. As Zatur pointed out the difficulties and Rudersdorf grudgingly agreed, neither the fleet's strength nor the Empire's projecting power supposed even a limited-scale overseas invasion. Even the suppression of neighboring countries was a strain on the Imperial Army, since it was set up for domestic interior lines operations rather than foreign invasions. Under these circumstances, the most we could do on the southern front would be combat on a limited scale for mainly political purposes. Will that work, you think? Which was why Zatur emphasized that they wouldn't be able to expect much from the military on the southern continent's front, saying that no matter how effective it would be from a purely military perspective, they couldn't expect to have command of the inner sea and be able to cut off transportation routes from the enemy. Oh, that's no problem. Our main objective is to draw the Kingdom of Ildoa onto our side by supporting them and their operations down there. I get where you're coming from, and I won't deny an idea just because it isn't purely military in nature. In response to the warning, Rudersdorf smiled and said he would readily accept politics as a limiting factor. It would be a nerve-wracking battlefield, but even if it was as roundabout an open sesame on the It would be a nerve-wracking battlefield, but even if it was as roundabout as Operation Open Sesame on the Rhine front, Rudersdorf and Zatur were interested in any operation that would be effective in achieving their political ends. They figured anything useful was worth trying. Even in the worst case, having a sympathetically neutral Kingdom of Ildoa might tell the Republic and Commonwealth that we could threaten their lifelines, especially in their colonies. That actually is something we need, but the usual logistical problems, eh? Rudersdorf asked with a perplexed expression. Zatur always spoke confidently, as if he were reading a formula or theory, so it was rare for him to trail off. Are our supply lines and communications lines really so strained as that? No, those issues I can overcome. I just can't shake the feeling that it would be essentially pointless deployment. No, those issues I can overcome. I just think and can't shake the feeling that it would be essentially a pointless deployment. Is a limited peace impossible? I don't mean to throw your words back at you, but why would a limited peace be impossible? We just do as Supreme High Command wills. A brief silence fell between them, and after meditating on the question, why can't we end this war, there was only one answer. Ultimately, I suppose, the problem is that we haven't completely defeated the enemy. It was all he could do to voice the words. Not fully defeating the enemy was a most regrettable error on their part. Their chance had slipped through their fingers while they were drunk on celebrating their triumph. Now, of course, their victory was still a victory. Encirclement, annihilation, advance, occupation, everything proceeded according to plan, and the Imperial Army had eliminated all their enemies. But there was one element missing from their celebration: the end of the war and the restoration of peace. Now that the Republican fleet they let escape had turned into a headache, shouting about resistance to the bitter end, peace seemed awfully far away. Thus, both of the generals felt the need to put the last nail in the coffin. If we must, then all we have to do is beat them. In that sense, if you think of sending troops to the southern continent as a move for the sake of peace, it's not a bad idea. Which was why Rudersdorf declared that they couldn't make the same mistake twice. That they wouldn't make the same mistake twice. They would simply defeat anyone who stood in their way and wipe out his men to the last. Understood. Then I shall arrange the right troops and commanders. Zatour's cheeks relaxed into a smile when he nodded in response to that confident reply. Yet something in his face said it still wasn't sitting right with him, and he repeated his previous comment. But I'd like you to bear one thing in mind, or rather, I want to reconfirm it with you. We are a nation with a land army, and we have prioritized interior lines strategy. As you say, you've pointed that out many times. The Imperial Army was designed and outfitted to move around inside the country. Sadly, the Empire was in a mad rush to give them a measure of expeditionary capability, but the Army's logistics arm had been overworked since the war started, and there were already reports of complicated obstacles emerging. That's right. Going to war in a foreign country is likely to put quite a strain on the Army's support services. Even if the sea command situation is different than in the waters near the Commonwealth mainland, an operation on the southern continent is still an overseas operation, strictly speaking. We'll have to be prepared for some losses. Zatour hesitated before continuing. But that's why I intend to deploy mainly light divisions. I don't plan on sending in very large units. You've said you understand that, so there should be no problem on that front. As the one in charge of the operation, I don't have a problem with light divisions, do you? No, there shouldn't be any issues, I don't think. They knew it would be a difficult expedition, which was why they chose light divisions. But the way Zatour said, there shouldn't be any issues, Rudersdorf couldn't help but hear some hesitation. My friend, what is it you want to say to me, truly? We must have made a mistake, don't you think? The way Major von Degrachow had shown up at the General Staff office, apparently wanting to say something urgently, had lingered strangely in the back of his mind. He knew right away that she had hesitated and returned to her base, unable to say whatever it was, for one reason or another. Now he could only speculate, but he almost had the feeling that back then she had wanted to scream at him, "You're making a mistake!" It was far too late now, but he wished he had heard her out. That's why he asked his brother-in-arms, "Were we wrong?" Rudersdorf, for his part, felt much the same as Zatour. Have we made a mistake? It was a strange feeling, but now that he mentioned it, yes, it was true indeed. I'm certain we must have. Remember that in war, we have an opponent, so things won't always go as we'd like. It's not uncommon that an enemy responds in an unexpected way, right? You're just so good at reading them that you don't screw up often enough. But though Rudersdorf didn't deny the error, he was going to cut his losses and not get overly caught up in it. In the fog of war, not every shot could hit the bullseye. All they could do was their best. And if they got the second best results, then hoping for anything more was too much. If you say so. Anyhow, let's keep the burden to a minimum. Very well. Frankly, I'd like to have as many reserve units on hand at home as I can, so it would be better if you could make do with as few as possible. Zatour was especially concerned with keeping the load on logistics light, and Rudersdorf nodded in agreement. It was certainly desirable to minimize the strain. So, he continued, okay, how about you give me those guys again? Your unit, the 203rd Aerial Mage Battalion, he added for clarity. They're only a 50-man load on logistics, but they pack much more punch than the usual augmented battalion, so it would be very efficient. As the one in charge of the operation, he also noted that having a simple-to-deploy mobile fighting force would yield the advantage of extended range of use. I need them to take out other aerial mages. Plus, if you unleash her without thinking, there's no telling how far she'll advance. But anyone who wanted to keep such a precious but anyone would want to keep such a precious asset handy. Zator wasn't about to let it go so easily. She'll lead the charge. I need her to mess them up down there. Let me have them. No, come on, let me have them. The exchange between the two generals nearly went on forever, but Rudersdorf's stubbornness finally paid off. Fine, I'll arrange it. Now then, I'm off to the next meeting to give formal notification of this. How about you? As Zator complained about more pain-in-the-ass arrangements to make, As Zator complained about more pain-in-the-ass arrangements to make, Rudersdorf let it go in one ear and out the other, and barreled right into the next topic. Sorry, I'm leaving this up to you. I'd like to inspect our troops, assuming we're headed into a fight with the Commonwealth. Got it. Let me know what you find out. No problem. Great, then let's both make it happen, eh? Alright, that ends that particular scene. Now, that was also included in the anime, so they've rendered it out of order in that later iteration of the series. This being the translation of the original material, this predated it by a good many years. So we now have a change of scenery. August 29th, Unified Year 1925. Imperial Army General Staff Office, joint meeting between the Service Corps and Operations. It's the appointed hour, gentlemen, a young officer announced in a nervous voice that it was time to start. Very well. I would like to begin the meeting to consider our plan to end the fighting on the Republican mainland and in the Auntaunt alliance, as well as the conflict with the Commonwealth that will entail. It was a meeting to decide the Imperial military's basic direction moving forward. Naturally, all the most important figures in the general staff, from the chief on down, were there. The agenda was simple. They would iron out the conflicting opinions about what the major course of action in the war should be. First, regarding the end of the fighting on the northern front, please see the documents you've been given. It's finally over, thank God. Though that wasn't entirely accurate, it seemed the best way to describe the dispute in the north, where the lines had been suppressed and a military government was finally situated in place. Finally, the long-awaited good news from the troubles and confusion of the northern area had come, although they couldn't deny it was a bit late. Their opponents had hung on for so long, even after their military and national strength had been overpowered. Of course, the fact that they had help from other powers couldn't be ignored. Even so, this had cost the Empire an awful lot of time and effort to achieve. For that reason, the faces of the generals in attendance looked far from happy. Grim, almost. But they judged those thoughts to be sentimental and did not indulge them. Their job now was to receive and approve the reports after the fact, but they were most interested in the current issues with the Commonwealth and the remnants of the Republic. They were already taking the practical stance that the Auntaunt alliance was only a matter of military governance. All that was left to do was pull together the might the Service Corps and Operations required and choose someone to rule. So the military governor will be chosen after consulting with Supreme High Command and the Personnel Division in the General Staff. This matter was concluded quickly with no complicated debates, just a couple brief questions regarding the final details of the matter. The meat of the conference was the next item on the agenda. Moving on, I would like to discuss the operation on the southern continent proposed by Service Corps Deputy Chief von Zatur. After being called on by the leader of the meeting, Lieutenant General von Zatur stood. He had recently been promoted due to the success of his plan to lure in and annihilate the Republican army. His next plan was another that split opinion in the general staff, a plan to check the Commonwealth mainland using the Great Army. They would amass the Great Army in the Republic as a show of force, while continuing their struggle for supremacy. He proposed a simultaneous operation on the southern continent using second-string units and whatever elites they could muster as a sort of offensive. At a glance, it seemed like he was placing importance on capturing the southern continent. But in actuality, as it was mainly an almost passive reorganization of the lines, and internally in the army at that, they took it as a defensive plan. Naturally, making the southern continent the main battlefield and waging war outside the empire was better for the country's defense. The analysis that defending the colonies removed from the mainland as they were would strain the Commonwealth's supply lines also made tactical sense. Still, on the whole, the Imperial staff took the proposal on a way to... I'm going to reread that paragraph. The analysis that defending the colonies removed from the mainland as they were would strain the Commonwealth's supply lines also made strategic sense. Still, on the whole, the Imperial staff took the proposal as a way to buy the time to reorganize their main forces, and nothing more. Zatur proposed it for the purpose of conducting effective harassment of the enemy. Some began to murmur that it was too passive. Wouldn't it be simpler to just send the main force over to the Commonwealth's mainland? There were even whispers that it could be the deciding battle. Naturally, the enemy had to protect both their mainland and their colonies. As a result, the colonies would probably be short on muscle and manpower. It went without saying, then, that the colonies would be easier to defeat. And if they succeeded in defeating the colonies, they would shave off a chunk of the Commonwealth's ability to continue fighting, and the foundations of the so-called Free Republic, or whatever they called themselves, would crumble to ashes. And that was why everyone was after a decisive battle on the Commonwealth mainland. Still, those same men did recognize the effectiveness of an operation on the southern continent. For one thing, it wouldn't be so hard to get the necessary troops together. And for another, they liked that the threat of defeat in the homeland would divide up enemy troops. Still, the majority wanted to avoid a roundabout operation and called earnestly for a direct strike on the Commonwealth mainland instead. If we do that, the war will end, they claimed. But Zatur felt the exact opposite. We'll force the enemy to exhaust themselves on the southern continent. During that time, the most pressing matters are putting down the partisans in the territory we are presently occupying and reorganizing the troops as an effective occupation force. He wasn't optimistic about their ability to take over the Commonwealth mainland. Ignoring the risks, even if they managed to conduct a landing operation at the end of an all-or-nothing naval battle, he could imagine that the Imperial troops would be exhausted. His greatest fear was that if that happened, some other power might interfere and topple them. I object. The Great Army is capable of rapid response. We should attack the Commonwealth before they fortify their defenses. Kindly recall the disparity of power between our navies, sir. We don't have command of the sea. At the same time, there was the practical issue of the Commonwealth's superior navy. The Imperial Navy simply didn't match it in terms of quality or quantity. Efforts in recent years had seen their naval power rapidly expand, granted, but they had to admit that they were still far behind. All the more reason to command the sky with our air and mage forces. Now, of course, any general at the meeting was aware of that. Though individually its ships outperformed those of the Commonwealth, the Empire couldn't win with hardware alone. The elements of training and skill were important, and neither could they discount the absoluteness of raw numbers. What could compensate for those things was the Empire's air and mage forces. As a matter of course, they imagined the air and mage forces would be used to wear down the enemy, achieve air supremacy, and weaken the enemy with anti-ship strikes. That could be said to be a rather ordinary idea, and the Imperial military was well prepared for it. Having gained experience on the Rhine front, those in the rear could attempt to provide more support. But the channel was still a big strategic obstacle for the Imperial army. The attack required crossing water, which was a real headache for the planners involved. Honestly, I don't like the idea of a battle of attrition being fought on enemy turf. They were picking the wrong opponent if they wanted to fight a prolonged battle to wear the enemy down. A battle of attrition at a powerful nation's home base was a tricky proposition. One wrong move and the Empire would be the first to exhaust itself. The fighting on the Rhine front had been along the border, so the parties had been on equal terms, more or less. But in an air battle over the enemy mainland, the enemy's fighting spirit would be running high. And if an enemy were shot down, they could rejoin the lines immediately. Fighting on their own turf, they didn't have to worry about being taken prisoner when they hit the ground. But if one of the Imperial Army's soldiers was shot down, they'd be lucky to be taken prisoner rather than executed on the spot. At that rate, even if they were downing each other at the same pace, the actual net losses per side would be completely different. And naturally, since the Imperial military couldn't endure the same rate of attrition as its enemy, it would constantly have to limit attrition on its own side while making things harder for the Commonwealth side. It wasn't impossible, but doing it in real life would be a major challenge, indisputably. Time is what we should be worried about. Once the enemy strengthens their defenses, it will be too late. At the same time, an invasion of the enemy mainland, once its defenses were fortified, would be reckless. Several staffers said a short war was the only way to resolve things and insisted on an offensive right away. If we don't attack now, they said, we'll be stuck facing heavily defended enemy positions and fortifications on the scale of the Rhine front. We can strengthen our defenses during that time as well. It seems to me our positions will be equal. Zatour's idea was simple. He believed the army was meant to protect the Empire, not the occupied territory. Therefore, the biggest priority wasn't to expand the occupied territory, but to conserve troops. Of course, it went without saying that he wanted to do that while also bleeding the enemy dry. Please understand the organizational limitations inherent in the fact that our army was arranged according to Interior Line's strategy with national defense in mind. We have practically sacrificed quite a lot of our expeditionary abilities in order to have qualitatively better, stronger soldiers. Yes, there was also the issue that doing so was really the only way to maintain such a large area, by which they mean control over such a large area. But ultimately, we can't end the war without muscling into their territory and forcing them to capitulate. Your concerns are valid, General von Zatour, but please understand that staying on the battlefield forever because of them will eat away at our national strength in due time. In short, it didn't matter one iota how the war was ended. In that sense, Zatour wasn't convinced it was absolutely necessary to conquer the Commonwealth mainland. On the contrary, he started to think it was a horrible idea that would bog them down to no end. And the folly of going in with a naval power was self-evident under the circumstances. He believed that their best chance of victory lay not in fighting on the enemy's turf, but in drawing them to the battlefield of the Empire's own choosing and annihilating them at a time that was appropriate. But he was vexed because circumstances wouldn't allow him to declare that openly. The others were proud of defeating the Republic and certain they could slay the Commonwealth in the same smooth motion. The operation planners under Lieutenant General von Rudersdorf were more understanding of the overall situation of the war, but the people and the bureaucrats had a tendency to say, "Oh, the Imperial Army can handle it," and expect too much of them. So Zatour reluctantly proposed a limited offensive instead. He narrowed it down to an operation that gave the best return on investment with the most limited bloodshed. Concealing his true feelings, he advocated for an attritional containment plan. Under the circumstances, he had no other choice. The front on the southern continent was a desert. Unlike on the mainland, a hard and fast rule applied there: survival of the fittest. At the time, there were three powers with influence on the southern continent: the Commonwealth, the Republic, and the Ispagna Collective. Of them, the Ispagna Collective had managed to remain neutral, mainly because it didn't have the wherewithal to intervene externally due to fierce internal political conflict. When they say Hispania Collective, they mean the Republic of Spain. So they're talking about the Spanish Civil War, in which it became a proxy war between fascism and communism. And the royalists basically got wiped out, and then the fascists promptly eliminated the communist threat, and Spain, in our timeline, became a fascist dictatorship, which decided, surprisingly at least, to remain neutral in World War II, and they had a dictator there for life, effectively. And when he eventually died, I think they eventually became a democracy with great difficulty. Anyway, continuing back with the book here. Of them, the Ispagna Collective had managed to remain neutral, mainly because it didn't have the wherewithal to intervene externally due to fierce internal political conflict. Complicating matters was the Kingdom of Ildoa, Italy, trying to squeeze itself in and quote-unquote settle. The result was an ambiguously colored map with both the group formed by the Turkman principalities and the Ildoan settlements. When they say Turkman principalities, they mean Turkmenistan possibly, or possibly Turkey, so the Ottoman Empire in our timeline. Did the Ottoman Empire go as far as Turkmenistan? I don't think so. So they're obviously talking just about the Ottoman Empire, also known as the Turkmen principalities in this context, and the Ildoan settlements. The jumble of sovereignties in the region could best be described in a word as utter chaos. Of course, one could paint the map in broad strokes. Most of the influence and puppet governments belonged to the Commonwealth and the Republic, respectively. Even if the nations of the southern continent were officially neutral, their allegiance was clear because of how they sent voluntary armies and offered supplies to aid and abet the enemy. But it wasn't as if everyone took the Reich as their enemy, of course. For instance, countries whose interests clashed with those of the Commonwealth and of the Republic in the struggle to acquire colonies on the southern continent sided with the empire. A representative example would be the Kingdom of Ildoa. It wasn't very difficult for the empire to ask the kingdom to form an alliance, given their common interests. Irritatingly to Republican diplomats, neighboring rival countries hoping to expand their sphere of influence were glad to see the decline of the Republic. And this was why the Kingdom of Ildoa chose to ally itself with the empire. Of course, the alliance didn't automatically mean it was at war with the Republic and Commonwealth. The planners have been careful enough to ensure that it didn't state as much. The agreement between the two countries basically provided that fighting was optional. There was no indication that joining the war was mandatory. At the same time, the Imperial Southern Continent Expeditionary Army Corps was deployed. The Kingdom of Ildoa remained ostensibly neutral. It did, however, allow the stationing, quote-unquote, of troops there out of consideration as an allied country. The empire, however, did not move on the offer very quickly. Because the empire had made light of the southern continent, it only sent a single army corps made up of 2 divisions and a support unit. And the general staff ended up having a heated debate about whether to commit more troops or not. The initial number of units was so few that the garrison of the Republican troops usually deployed there could have resisted them with ease. Everyone thought at the time that the Imperial units would work on gathering more fighting power, After all, a single puny army corps didn't pose much of a military threat. Still, they agreed there was a major political significance in the Imperial Army's presence on the continent. The Watcher analysis that Army Corps Commander von Rommel was dispatched for political reasons, namely expansion of influence and respect for the Empire's ally, was widely shared as the plausible explanation, which was why everyone expected the lull to continue for the foreseeable future. Even the division of the General Staff involved in giving orders to the Imperial Army was half serious about that idea. In any case, they had deployed some troops, but they weren't sure if the front should really be a priority or not. After all, there was no apparent gains to be made by sending troops there in the first place. If the objective hadn't been to wear the enemy out further in this total war, sending Imperial soldiers probably wouldn't have even been on the table. In that sense, predicting a lull was a respectable analysis. The betrayal of everyone's expectations occurred because of a surprising move in the field. The root cause was Commander von Rommel. Neither their enemies nor their allies thought the Southern Continent Expeditionary Force was going to move, but the moment they arrived, they jumped into action. The world was reminded that a capable general doesn't waste time and sit on his laurels. The Commonwealth units who had just arrived to defend the Republican colonies probably got the worst of it. Those fresh troops hadn't been fully baptized on the battlefield, so they could think of no reason the two Imperial divisions would be stationed on the southern continent besides a political one. Having thus discounted them, the Commonwealth didn't even really go on guard, and that's how the Imperial units under Commander von Rommel nailed every last one of them. The Imperial Army, waging maneuver warfare unparalleled in history against an enemy that outnumbered them by several times, simply bulldozed the Commonwealth troops in terms of caliber, particularly because half of them were elites forged in blood on the Rhine front. Hence, the Commonwealth units, who hadn't dreamed they'd be fighting a mobile battle in the desert, were dealt an early brutal blow and sent scrambling in a disorderly retreat. It was obvious what strategy General De Lugo would adopt in response. He put some political moves on the Kingdom of Ildoa while simultaneously doing what he could to ensure support wouldn't reach the Ildoans. But Rommel was quicker than De Lugo was shrewd. Future generations would rave about his clever tactics. As soon as he realized time wouldn't necessarily work in his favor, despite having barely any units, he made a feint, hit the Taurus naval base with a sneak attack, and captured it successfully. While securing a base that didn't depend on the Kingdom of Ildoa, he dealt a serious blow to Republican and Commonwealth logistics. The Taurus naval base had been the Republican and Commonwealth supply base, so its fall had far-reaching implications for the situation on the ground. In the end, contrary to initial predictions, the Imperial Army Southern Continent Expeditionary Corps asserted its presence resoundingly. Most importantly, Imperial citizens went wild when they saw the string of successes on the front. The people had been convinced the Empire defeated the Republic on the Rhine lines after investing a vast amount of money and lives. To then continue the war risked the people starting to hate it. The General Staff weren't the only ones worried about that, but contrary to their estimates, the troops dominated on the southern continent. The winning streak continued after Dacia and the Rhine sent the people into a frenzy. The winning streak continuing after Dacia and events on the Rhine sent the people into a frenzy. The battles unfolded as if the Empire's army was completely unrivaled across the world. The excited citizenry became pro-war and showed their support valiantly. As a result, the troops were expected to achieve even more in the field. To the General Staff, that full picture was a big miscalculation. They welcomed it insofar as it meant receiving support for continuing the war. At least, there were no signs that the people were under the influence of anti-war dissidents. That the General Staff could wholeheartedly embrace. but the appearance of a hero in the southern continent and their growing inability to gauge a time to withdraw frightened them to no end. The loss of control faction in particular, rallying around General von Zatour, put up a powerful resistance against the aggressive faction seeking to increase war gains. To them, sending any more troops than absolutely necessary to the southern continent was a waste of time and resources that was difficult to accept. Even the strain on supply lines would be insupportable. What about convoy ships? What about transport ships? What about direct support units? The talk went on. And it wasn't just the lost control faction fretting about these things. The mere thought of the mountain of challenges was enough to make any logistics officer want to bury their head in their hands and groan in frustration and agony. Though the issue went further back than that, given that the Imperial Army was organized around interior lines strategy, they weren't even sure they could project their power properly in a foreign country, at least not for long. Moving a corpse on the southern continent was totally different from moving one within their home country. Even a single rifle manufactured at home had to travel a complicated route to get to a soldier in the south. And they had to assume that some percentage of them would be damaged during transport and that whole ships could be sunk on the way. For the divisions concerned, it was worse than horrible, and in general, the Imperial Army couldn't endure losses like that, not at this stage, and the Imperial military had only envisioned a seaborne transport capability as far as shuttling troops to and from the Imperial-occupied territory in Norden. As a result, there hadn't been an urgent need to aggressively acquire transport ships, and maintenance was performed very slowly on those few they had. On top of that, the Empire was a landlocked nation, more or less. A land nation. They aren't landlocked. What am I saying? Germany has a sea coast. On top of that, the Empire was a land nation with very little concept of major sea route defense. Even their theoretical knowledge of convoying stopped at a basic awareness. That was sure to come back around to bite them in the ass in due time. The Commonwealth and the Republic, on the other hand, were self-sustaining to some extent thanks to a degree of industrial base in the colonies. Not only that, but they had more ships than they could count. Meanwhile, the Imperial Army could count on supplies from the new areas of Imperial influence, of course, but the Empire was only connected to them in so much as they had common interests. Naturally, any respectable soldier would be apprehensive about relying on supplies from there. So the General Staff ended up in another heated debate. Everyone felt they had to stop the front from expanding any further, but could they really ignore the enemy? They were right there for the taking. For Zatour, who had decided that they should consider shaping up the lines if need be, the time had come to devote themselves to overhauling the organization of their defensive lines and exercising their influence on other countries behind the scenes. But before the General Staff reached their conclusion, another report came flying in from the south. It was notice of what could be called a great victory. The news that the troops were in the process of increasing their gains with a follow-up attack would simultaneously send the people into a renewed frenzy and cause the logistical difficulties for Zatour to expand greatly. Luckily, Zatour didn't know that yet. September 4th, Unified Year 1925, the Imperial Capital. He still couldn't forget his impression the first time he saw the unit getting deployed to the southern continent. He had been excited to hear about his reports. But then there were only 2 divisions on the roster. One was a light infantry division, a new unit made up of mainly fresh troops and reservists. As for the other division, consisting of the few veterans he'd been allotted, not even a generous evaluation would say they were in good shape. They may have had ex-fighting power on paper, but they had sustained heavy losses on the Rhine front. General von Zatour had served in the Rhine, so he was more than well aware. General von Rommel had served on the Rhine, so he was more than well aware of how that could affect their strength. Any normal commander would despair if they couldn't expect power commensurate to their head count. To Rommel, the order to fight the Southern campaign was some scraped-together To Rommel, the order to fight the Southern campaign with some scraped-together second-string troops was preposterous, which was why he petitioned the General Staff for additional troops. But he didn't get a proper answer. Unable to bear the status quo, he made a direct request, and the answer he received, after much posturing, was the additional deployment of an augmented mage battalion. And how generous! It was the fine unit reporting directly to the Service Corps and operations in the General Staff. He was thrilled to get a first-string unit with proper gear, combat experience, and a full lineup. But the high spirits that nearly had him shouting for joy were crushed when he received the commander's evaluations. No, the evaluations themselves were fine. The Academy, for instance, said she was up to the field officer standards. That alone made her a promising officer. Also, she had completed her higher education in the War College to qualify as a General Staff officer. Rare for a magic officer, frankly. And the War College also had nice things to say about her, that she met all standards desirable for an officer in the field. These were, fairly favorable evaluations, quite honestly. They guaranteed that she possessed more than the standard knowledge of either a staff or field officer. But now, it was wartime. The most important evaluations during a war are the ones from the battlefield, and those were all over the place, quite honestly. There were a pile of especially severe criticism from the Northern Army group. They said she was transferred after voicing a clear objection to those in authority. The Western Army group declined to evaluate her, saying her good and bad points neutralized each other, so it was difficult to rate her. Furthermore, she had attempted at least once to resist orders. She was truly a hard one to judge, but if her good points balanced out her bad points despite an attempt to disobey orders, he could smell some sort of competence under the brim. But that didn't mean he wanted the type of officer who would try such a thing under his command. And in this situation, where he had so few units to work with, the commander of the unit he should rely on the most was such a character as this? It was beyond ridiculous. Rommel continued reading with a fed-up look on his face. But the ambiguous comments from the tech lab, that though the project she had been on had achieved things it wasn't worth it, didn't do anything to make him feel any better. After reading, he thought two things. One was that almost all of these evaluations were from headquarters. Apparently, the troops serving directly under her thought she was a great field officer. Still, it was rare to receive such a difficult person as a subordinate. Mages who followed orders but objected to the brass's plans had a tendency to get passed over. After all, they were hard to handle. The second was that, although the evaluations were contradictory, she had achieved enough that she was considered an outstanding combat soldier. Awkwardly, regardless of how she was an officer, as an individual mage, she was thought very highly of. Her number of kills was amazingly among the highest on the Rhine front. Plus, as a field officer, she had led breakthrough charges and ambushes unfazed. One officer called her, quote-unquote, Mad Dog. Apparently, the trendy nickname for her at the moment was Rusted Silver, and he could see how that made sense. The ring of it was far from the elegance of her alias, White Silver, but he found it an appropriate one. He'd heard that the Republicans called her the Devil of the Rhine. In any case, strictly as a mage, she was unrivaled. As an officer, too, she was by no means incompetent. So they must have been giving her to him as reinforcements and as an excuse to get her out of their hair for a while. Honestly, he felt like they were foisting off their problem on him. They're telling me to take a mad dog out on a walk with no leash? He let slip a complaint. Maybe it was just prejudice, but that wasn't what it felt like to General von Rommel. After all, he was basically being asked to bet on a bad hand. This isn't some joke. I'm not going to send my men to their doom so easily. That bunch in the General Staff are only looking at the death toll as a statistic, goddammit. Thus, he ended up muttering complaints about the General Staff's practice of pushing its neck's pains onto those in the field. Well, I'll at least meet her. General von Rommel had decided to wait for Major von Degrachaff. That was his way of showing respect for a magic officer who had gotten results, although his preconceived notions led him to brace himself when her arrival was announced. Departing from the text for a moment, the scorecard that was in the pre-pages on, I do believe it was page 3 of the text, first, back of page 1 more or less of the behind the cover, the performance evaluation scorecard we saw at the beginning with various typed part and then the handwritten notes at the bottom from von Legren, that is probably what Rommel is having in front of him right now. So interesting. They actually have a context for that within the story. Intriguing. Anyway, I'll pick up from roughly where I was before. This isn't some joke. I'm not going to send my men to their doom so easily. That bunch in the General Staff are only looking at the death toll as a bloody statistic. Thus, he ended up muttering complaints about the General Staff and their practice of pushing its neck pains onto those in the field. Well, I'll at least meet her. General von Rommel had decided to wait for Major von Degrachaff. That was his way of showing respect for a magic officer who had gotten results, although his preconceived notions led him to brace himself when her arrival was announced. He introduced her into his office to have her report in, and once they got through the dispassionate formalities, his bad habit of trying to figure people out reared its head. But he was already surprised to see that Major von Degrachaff, like him, preferred formal, matter-of-fact exchanges. After all, mages and officers were a proud bunch. Perhaps you could say they were too proud. But either way, everyone in the Imperial military knew it for a fact. So he had expected the magic officer to be the aggressive, violent type, despite her outward appearance. And Rommel himself expected that sort of person to get a bit upset or even angry at being welcomed with such bureaucratic fluff. So it was a refreshing reprieve and surprise to find that she calmly reported with the same empty courtesy as he, completely unshaken. At that point, Rommel admitted to himself that his calculations had been off. A magic officer with no sense of shame, eh? Maybe that's why she ignored orders and attempted to resist. His concerns as an officer in combat crossed his mind. True, she has a stout heart, but she's the type to take matters into her own hands. He could sense it instinctively, and that worried him. How did she decide? As Rommel started to worry, Degrachaff interrupted. Lastly, General, I'd appreciate the authority for my battalion to act independently. Graciously, with a poker face, she continued. The General Staff has approved it, and the way she made her request... Graciously, with a poker face, she continued. The General Staff has approved it. And the way she made her request was so arrogant it was invigorating. I do believe they should say infuriating. Rommel was said to be overly proud of himself, so the fact she casually made this amazingly brazen request was fantastic. Any commissioned officer would understand, just from hearing her make that one comment, why the Northern and Western Army groups couldn't control her. Having a mage battalion drop out of command structure was almost like losing a whole division. Normally, no commander could possibly accept a separate chain of command. Oh, that goes without saying. And Major von Degrachaff, now that you've said that much, I'm sure I can expect your unit to achieve great things, right? But apparently, she didn't care for Rommel's tone and reaction. Her silence made it clear she objected to his doubt of their ability. As an attitude taken in response to a superior officer's question, it was unbelievably insolent of her. Ah, but it actually made Rommel realize why his superiors had given him the cold shoulder. Even Rommel hadn't been this presumptuous, though. It says bumptuous, actually. Well, what do you think? He pressed her for a response, unconsciously hardening his voice. If she didn't answer now, he didn't care what the General Staff said. He would send her back, and her men too. General von Rommel, with all due respect, I merely omitted the effort of responding to a question that is impossible to answer. What? But the response he got made him answer with another question. What the fuck did she just say? A question that's impossible to answer. I'm a soldier, not a smooth talker. I'm afraid I'm unable to explain our military capability in words. Her tone suddenly changed. In addition to her self-important attitude, it exuded heavy sarcasm. And even if I were, I doubt it would satisfy you, sir. Therefore, I am unable to answer your question. The words rang in his ears. He heard them. They were in the official language of the Empire, pronounced correctly in the standard Imperial way. He had no trouble making them out. Her voice was clear as a bell. Yet in spite of that, for a moment he couldn't fathom her intentions. Did the girl in front of me really just say something I can't follow? He struggled to understand. Then a little while later, he finally grasped the significance of the string of words. In other words, you mean to say, seeing is believing. That's what you wanted to tell me? I respectfully leave the interpretation up to you, General. Please trust me and my unit. Silence. In her eyes was an earnest appeal. If it was only a ruse, it was utter madness. He was dumbfounded in spite of himself. The feeling could only be described as shock at having witnessed something unbelievable. A single thought came to mind. Frontline syndrome. Major von Degrachoff had countless symptoms of it. The way she warned him, albeit indirectly, don't ask stupid questions. Don't fuck with me. The way she threatened him at the same time. Don't you understand how powerful I am? But then there was the logic of her sincere responses. So not only was she arrogant, but she was clearly, horribly, and utterly warped. She doesn't believe in anything. Not the power of the military's leadership, not their strategy, and probably not even her fellow soldiers. Despite that, she's surprisingly loyal to the Imperial Army for some reason or other. You could even call her a peerlessly loyal eccentric focused solely on being the nation's guard dog. I see. Rommel understood the reason she had been disobedient in the past. She simply decided that she would be a patriot if it was good for the nation. In short, she's a capable lunatic, but the bad part is she doesn't even realize she's twisted. Major, I don't have enough evidence to trust you. She's crazy, and competent, and more sincere than anyone I've ever known. Rare for Rommel, she was someone he was unable to judge. He did know, however, that she would not be easy to handle. That was why he asked her how he could trust her. It's pointless for me to enumerate my feats. I'm at your service, sir. And her response was an obvious point. Rommel could appreciate the attitude that actions spoke louder than words, typically. He wasn't conceited about her ability. Neither was she a slave to her power. She spoke matter-of-factly. She was probably capable of judging what was possible and what would be difficult. If not, she couldn't play with fire in the front of an ammunition dump like she was now. In short, her insanity was backed up by limitless ability. He could only conclude that she was crazy. I want to see what you can do. No, don't misunderstand. I mean as a strategist. I'll call her a hero, a nut, a fellow soldier. So she needs to demonstrate what she's capable of. If she's merely a wild animal tainted by madness? Is she merely a wild animal tainted by madness? Or is she a cunning beast in possession of a deranged intellect? Rommel suddenly realized he wanted to know the answer to that question. I'm sending you on a flying mission. I'd like you to take the second group. Incidentally, the idea is to give you, as Kampfgruppen 7, authority on par with the other Kampfgruppen, even though you are a single battalion. Don't disappoint me. I'll try her out on a somewhat independent mission. Well, I have an idea how it'll turn out, but I hope she gets results. Understood, sir. We'll meet your expectations. Just look at that. That evil grin. She looks utterly thrilled. She's so happy to have a place to fight and men to kill. Without a doubt, she's going to end up being the most horrible person I know, and she'll probably also be my most reliable friend on the battlefield. Okay, this ends Chapter 5. Chapter 6, the Southern Campaign, will be next. Now, I just gotta say, this is epic. We have now passed the Rubicon and reached the point where the TV series ended on we've ended the point where the anime TV series ended on season 1, and we have progressed into what will likely be the opening act of the movie, which is coming out later this year. I am turbo hyped as fuck. This is going to be absolutely amazing. Like, I mean, I've pre-read the next few chapters in this, obviously. I haven't had the chance to record them as yet, but I'm telling you, shit's getting so good from here, man. I'm dying to find out what the hell happens. I'm willing to bet the movie is probably going to cover... Pardon me, just had to burp for a moment. I am willing to bet the movie is going to cover all of the remainder of Volume 3 here. And I am willing to bet that it is also possibly going to extend into part of Volume 4, depending. I don't know. But, like, oh god, this is just... And I'm also something of like a Rommel fanboy, too. I mean, I'm in the middle of reading Infantry Attacks or Infantry Bereft Anne right now. And the Rommel Papers, which is basically the second book that was started writing by Rommel from all of his tactical notes, and then was later compiled and published by his wife after he died, as well as his family, in order to basically make money to keep ends meet. I want to read that, and at some point I'm going to get around to buying a copy and either making an audiobook of it for my own enjoyment, or just plain reading it cover to cover in like a matter of days. And that's a huge book, so bear with me when I say that it's kind of nuts, but I really want to. Like, we finally hit this point in this story where I'm just kind of fanboying out a little bit, and I can't deny it's going to be epic as hell. Like, yeah. Forward with the Southern Campaign, boys. This is going to be good. All right. See here. It's 9:56 p.m. on October 31st, 2018. Signing off. Auf Wiedersehen.